ETOD process across the city. This is the first of 4 corridors across the city that are looking at transit-oriented development and the implementation of rapid transit within Raleigh. We want to make sure that the community understands what these changes are, and those changes are about the zoning and policy that would help guide new development around our transit stations, providing opportunity for affordable housing within this growth, pedestrian and bike safety, and looking at the urban design and streetscape recommendations that would guide growth along New Bern in the future. For shops in October, we went away and really assumed that information, provided some initial recommendations. So tonight's a presentation of those ideas. We'll come back to you in February with the full report, but we want to get some information and buy-in on policy. Start really big picture here. Now this is about corridor wide in our vision. We've developed, if you remember from the workshops, we had vision statements for each community, western, the middle, and eastern. From that, we derived a vision statement that's about the broader corridor. New Bern Avenue's transformation prioritizes the creation of opportunities for current and new residents to thrive together, from diverse and affordable new housing options to support to businesses and entrepreneurs. This growth aims to broaden equitable access to residents and visitors, all connected through high quality mobility options. So this is sort of the big picture sort of vision, and how do we do that? We have 4 pillars. New Bern is a connector, recognizing that it connects us to a variety of jobs and services, and eventually it connects us to other mobility options elsewhere in the city. We really use this as a guide for all of our infrastructure upgrades, walkability, head bike, etc. Within that, we have 3 goals. Prioritize safe pathways for bikes and pedestrians. Support the replanting and investment of landscape and public realm improvements along New Bern Avenue that are not part of the BRT project. And 3 is identify strategic improvements to the public realm that will support walkability throughout the entire corridor. Our second guiding principle is grow together. And that's making sure that we recognize that Raleigh is a growing city, that we want to make sure everyone is part of that process, whether it's through information or understanding your options in housing, et cetera. We want to make sure that everyone knows what that growth looks like. Through that, we have 3 primary goals. One is providing sustained education about that growth and making sure people know the options, the rights, and what this change means. Number 2 is developing clear materials about the changes and a single-stop resource center for this information. 3 is targeted growth at strategic sites that can accommodate new forms of building and capitalize on missing middle strategies for existing communities. Our 3rd pillar is embrace New Bern's personalities. We have a lot of different typologies of community along this corridor, and we want to make sure we recognize and honor them. That provides us 3 goals. 1 is establish streetscape standards, wayfinding and cultural paths that relate to each of the 3 geographic areas of New Bern Avenue. Create landscape standards for new development aligned to each personality. Provide building and urban design guidelines that highlight the historic and architectural influences of each area that provide information for new development. And then lastly, we have prepare for change. The nuts and bolts of what we do, making sure that we have the right guides to implement this vision. Sorry. Goal 1 is the amendments to the base zoning. So you guys looked at all the maps coming in. That's really about that goal, the baseline of the goals within that. Find the actual steps, roles, and responsibilities to ensure this plan work is completed. Prioritizing acceptable activities that qualify to the equity fund. And then reducing carbon emissions and improve community health by allowing more people to live and work in walkable places that are served by transit. So this is sort of our big picture guidance pieces, what we learned from you as a community member, and this is what really drives a lot of the work that we're doing today. We have 5 themes under this. One is our permitting framework. So this is really about what we heard in the community and a synopsis of that information. We have 3 geographic regions. They have 3 very different characters to them. The Western Station which we're in is that sort of more traditional urban character, the streetcar community. Closest to downtown, the middle stations are more of that suburban style of car-centric, housing and park-like settings, and then the eastern stations, the corridor that's dominated by mostly retail car-centric uses. That's where we're starting at today. But what that really means is we're looking at this in a broad textured component. I'm going to go through the 3 regions here really quick. The western areas, which we were identified during our first workshop. Some of the key things that we came out of that was this notion of main streets within that, from Raleigh to Tarboro, and a more transit-centric component here, with strategic sites for new density opportunities along St. Augustine, conversations with them, the DMV site potentially along the edges of Church here, the Explorer site. And then the idea of more focused growth around missing middle strategies. So making sure that we utilize those strategic sites and ways to provide that density within the community, all focused on making sure people understand if they want to provide an additional housing unit on the property, that they know their rights and options within that, and that it's not just developers doing that. Within the middle area, we talked a lot about the landscape character of this corridor, and we want to honor that, and you'll see that in our zoning requirements. So how do we make sure that we sensitively provide that landscape outcome, but while still taking on density along the corridor itself? We have strategic sites identified along the southern edge of New Bern at the shopping center and here at Raleigh Boulevard, as well as potential sites here at Wake Med. We do note a few gateway opportunities along the way, and these are really more about urban design, the transition between communities. We also are identifying some of these pathway opportunities as connectors to and from our community, more in that north-south connection. And how do we prioritize that as we move forward with our recommendations? Lastly, is the eastern areas. We have a lot of zones that we're calling sort of areas of change, with those blue, more purple areas that limited change, more stable. It's new housing, and it's actually least likely to change over time. But we do identify a couple strategic opportunities, the one at Tower Road, and then a couple of parcels at the end of the line near the Walmart. The key priority of this segment is making sure that pedestrian and bike safety improvement are top of mind, and that it's safe walking paths along New Bern and across New Bern within this area. We have our next theme is called community and economic development. This is really about the housing and business opportunities along New Bern.
Has joined the meeting.
The key themes of this is the strong diversity of neighbors and intergenerational makeup of the community is something that we want to continue to protect, promote, enhance. A lot of people value living near downtown. We want to make sure that as many people that want to live downtown in a walkable community can in a variety of ways. And that residents love being able to walk to small businesses within the neighborhood. So how do we continue those pieces? This is our approach. 4 things. One is maintaining that diversity. How do we make sure that the maximum amount of people can live and work in these areas as possible? We want to create lift. How do we make sure that everyone is participating within that and that they feel empowered and part of this process? 3 is rebuilding community trust. I've heard it tonight, I've heard it before, is that we have a lot of work to do together to build that trust together and grow together. And then lastly is connecting people with places and making sure that we utilize BRT in a way that makes sense for everybody. You're going to see a lot of matrices tonight like this. I just want to say I'm not going to read everything on here. You'll have plenty of time to read these recommendations. A couple of things that I want to just highlight here is a few items. One, under maintaining diversity is we want to find ways to prioritize current and former residents of these communities for the new affordable housing rental opportunities that are coming forward. We're still working through that idea, but it's a priority that's top of mind, and it's something that we will continue as we work forward in our final plan. We have a couple of policies here that are about supporting current homeowners, things like funding repairs to their homes and property tax relief for low-income seniors, et cetera. And how do we make sure that those that are living in the community still stay in the community within that? We heard a lot from community members under rental housing itself about the targeted areas of who's getting affordable housing. So we want to recognize that and make sure we're looking at that deeper affordable housing component and prioritizing that within our plan. And that we're looking at this idea of financial and technical support to existing and new businesses along New Bern that reinforce and support the idea of a Black Main Street along the corridor. We've heard from the Black business community, we've heard from community members. We want to find a way to maintain and grow that idea and support that through financial and technical assistance. There's the next component within this are looking at part of that conversation concerning business owners is this, and community members, is that we want to create a community-based center that various city agencies, contractors, and partners can work directly with residents. This is an idea that's about building a storefront within the community where it's a single resource of information, consultation, and community gathering that we can provide this information on a consistent basis in a sustained education component. So these policies are really around our community and economic development piece, our housing and business creation, and we'll continue to drive down into the details of funding and finance within that. But we want to highlight that these are the key priorities within that piece. There's some other little nuanced components in here as well, like acquiring the DMV site and partnering with St. Augustine to support mixed-use developments, as well as a shared leadership model for community partnerships and making sure that everyone has a voice at the table. And then we're also looking at development of new housing subdivided, innovative, diverse housing types, and that idea of community engagement along the Eastern Station. We have a segment called History and Culture, and this is largely to recognize the diverse history within these neighborhoods and making sure that this is top of mind. While this may sound nice to have or extra to our communities, history and culture are really what bring our communities together and continue the story of how we grow. And so we're looking at a few things here. It's the iconic component of these neighborhoods. How do we preserve some of that identity? And then integrating new ideas into the larger corridor. That approach is three words that I like to say: protect, promote, and present. So we're protecting historic spaces that are within our community and using them in ways. We're promoting the historical and cultural assets within our community, programming or signage or community walks, et cetera. And we're presenting the history of each community through that art opportunity, streetscapes, building preservation, et cetera. Two components within that are really, really key is the historic storytelling and the public art installation. And the city actually works, Jason, correct me, it's the city public art committee, providing a consultation within this. And I'll zoom in on this map a little bit closer. The western areas are largely filled with a lot of that cultural significance. And there were a few ideas that were presented, and this will continue to evolve, but these were some of the initial ideas that people brought forward. One is a cultural walk from St. Augustine and St. Agnes all the way down to Frontage Gardens, making Tarboro a cultural walking path. The idea of Black Main Street existing from Raleigh Boulevard westward, where that exactly lands, is still up for discussion. And then there were a number of identified cultural components through John Winters Park and a series of public art installations as well. And so we want to make sure that we're curating this and have all the elements on this. So I do value anybody that has input on these, that we make sure that we record that through this process. Our next thematic element is mobility. Key things that we just want to highlight is that New Bern functions differently today on a car basis than it did in the past. Crashes and safety are still a concern along this. We want to prioritize correcting that, but we also want to make sure equity is top of mind throughout that process. So our approach are in 4 ways. One is focus on safety, increase access, both north, south, east, west on this corridor, acknowledge that equity question and making sure we're prioritizing those improvements in unique ways. And then 4 is that set to action. It's a lot of lines on a map. I want to highlight, thank you, Timothy, this team for pulling this together. I'm going to go segment by segment, just at a very high level. We talk a lot about Tarboro here in the western stations as a north-south priority component, but Oakwood continues to be that parallel connection opportunity that connects both the eastern and middle stations together, and then down over Pool Road. Pool Road being another connector to this intersection, and then Swain being that other north-south connector along far western part of these areas. Again, we're trying to prioritize the key walkability components and making sure that we're considering the implementation in a rapid way. Within the middle areas, the key theme in these areas were really about the nodes and at the station areas and helping to prioritize key intersections that we can potentially achieve north-south crossing in a safe manner, either now or in the future. And then also those sort of safe walking paths to school and connecting to the Crabtree Creek component and finishing those paths along Bern. The eastern stations are really about stitching a car-centric retail space together over time. So this is probably the longer term components within these areas, is starting to create and reconstruct these areas in a gridded network of streets, parallel running streets eventually along New Bern, next to New Bern, that can provide that connectivity across the community, connections across the belt line that will connect eventually to the Crabtree Creek pathway, and then really prioritizing the BR to New Bern and looking for ways to making sure it's as safe to walk and bike on that. Few of the key recommendation items that we really want to highlight is making sure that our focus is on first and last mile implementation. Once you get off the station, how do you get to your house? Once you get off the station, how do you get to work? Making sure that we have those paths clearly defined and implemented as soon as possible. Prioritizing non-vehicle modes and making sure that we look at this in a holistic manner, balancing the options across the corridor. And then we're looking at, in an action way, and a way to report back to you, is a marketing program, a reporting program around neighborhood traffic management. Now, I have a whole number of lists here, and you guys can look through it, but these are really sort of more targeted, lower scale recommendations. But I just want to highlight all the key components that are going to be really top of mind as we move forward. Longer term, we also are looking at that I-440 connection, sidewalk connections in the eastern areas. And then also a road diet on Corporation Parkway and a park once and walk concept in Eastern Stations. Open space and public realm were top of mind in a conversation, and we had a conversation tonight too, is if we're growing, how are our parks being used? What kinds of new spaces do we need? How are we accommodating the opportunity for people to enjoy the outdoors, which a lot of people in Raleigh do? We heard some themes during our workshops, is looking at enhancing existing resources. There are a lot of parks, and actually most of the corridor has parks within a 5-minute walk. There are a few gaps that we highlighted in our workshops, but adding small spaces and connecting to them are really key components. So we heard from community members that parks are important, but they don't need big parks. We need small parks that we can walk to, making sure that we have a broad network of options. And so that broader theme is about creating a corridor-wide system that everyone understands the scale and different types of parks and amenities along that corridor, and making sure we have safe connects to. Within this, we have 4 approaches that we're really trying to work with the city on and making sure that we highlight those to the Parks Department. One is evaluating existing assets and making sure we understand the state of repair, prioritization of those repairs or expansions, making sure that it has a larger system identity to it and that it's really unified within that. Expanding our partnerships and making sure our community members are part of that conversation. And whether that's through programming or operations, we want to still continue those conversations. And then 4 is creating design templates for parks so that people know the type of scale and character of these areas that if a new development comes in, say like at the DMV site, and there's a park being proposed, they understand the type of park that is being asked for within the community. This map shows existing and proposed assets along with the open space network. Key components, each geographic area. These areas that we've highlighted here are opportunities for public-private partnership through redevelopment efforts. They mimic the strategic sites that we showed you in the urban framework plan. And so as we expect, as those new developments come online, some sort of open space is part of that conversation. We're looking at potential opportunities for connections and reinforcing these north-south pathways, as well as small-scale interventions here in the west side. We have shown, I think the middle area has some of the best opportunities for trails and paths, both through Lake Med and connecting to the Factory Creek Trail, as well as Inlow High School and finishing some of those connectivity pieces. We have indicated a potential pathway opportunity along the edge of the country club. And we think that that is a unique opportunity, especially if we're considering redevelopment in these areas. The eastern areas, because of that restitching and the existing assets that are here, we're looking at the opportunity within these redevelopment sites of potentially new open space and the potential addition of the green space here on the south. Some of our larger recommendations here are using green and blue assets to connect the BRT station with the Factory Trail. Developing new walking paths to Wake Med campus and leading those path systems, and then expanding the blue ribbon trail system there in the middle area. But I think the last component of our piece is really the nuts and bolts of those were all the sort of directional, broader community assets, but the meat of this project is the land use and zoning pieces. What we were looking at here and in our mission and mandate was make sure that the zoning and land use policy is amended in strategic ways, that New Bern is ensuring certainty for new development opportunities, and that we're really providing that clear direction to new development. And we want to signal where changes occur along the corridor and what measures will be in place to incorporate new development. How we approach this, we're in 5 elements. One is to rezone the base districts. So understanding the base zoning of these communities and how it supports transit-oriented development. We're adjusting that building form to make sure it's matching community character, but also intensifying strategic ways. We want to make sure we're matching that local identity. So we have a few new things in our zoning tools that are matching our community character, specifically along New Bern. But the priority is activating our streets and making sure that it has good quality pedestrian connections, and buildings help support that in a variety of ways. The Tod Overlay District, which was approved while we were here in October, the initial one, the broad piece, how we lay that out. The priority of that overlay is creating a walkable and engaging public realm around station areas. So that's looking at things like reducing setbacks to make sure that buildings are more active and along those corridors, promoting a variety of mixed-use development with active uses, and supporting a level of intensity that will support the BRT. Transit and land use are intrinsic to each other. We have to make sure that they are connected in a unique way, that development can happen that supports the walkability and vice versa. Some of the key components of this overlay that I want to highlight is that affordability bonus. So we allow a base height, but then we allow more height if you're providing on-site affordable housing units. There's an employment bonus for job generating uses. Residential zone parcels will allow additional building types and densities, particularly next to the bus rapid transit system. Parking requirements, the minimum parking requirements are removed, and it's up to the developer to propose those parking ratios. And it prohibits auto-oriented types of uses within those zones. If there's an auto-oriented use currently today, it can stay as long as it operates, but new uses would have to be more transit supportive. The building frontage, so the building fronting the street must have that front door and then wider sidewalks, and then it must include bicycle parking and amenities for pedestrians, right, or runners. The corridor so the TOD overlay that we're proposing is targeted within areas with development potential. It's a continuity of a space to facilitate a comfortable pedestrian experience, and it's connected to the community. It's connecting the community to transit. So we'll walk through this really quick, if not really quick. I'll take my time. So this is the first layer of this is the TOD overlay itself. So this is the areas along the corridor that would reduce parking minimums. It would require the more active frontages. It would promote that density bonus, and it's in a continuous path along the corridor that promotes transit supported densities. And I'm going to go through each of these in the corridor wide, and then I'll go down to each geographic region and highlight a few things. The next layer to this are our base height changes. So within this, we have 3 height changes. The first is this darker orange, which is the base height of 5 stories with a bonus of additional 2 stories for a maximum of 7. We have in the middle areas here, we have a base height of 3 stories up to 5. And then further east in these more car-centric areas, we're proposing 7 stories with a height up to 12. So it gets progressively higher out in the suburban areas, but in these tight-knit urban areas, we're trying to toggle it based on the existing character of those communities. Lastly, we have some base zoning changes, and I think the big story here is looking at the middle segment, where we're creating something called the residential mixed use with green plus. So this is residential mixed use density with a frontage that requires additional landscaping components within that. There are some minor changes in the corridor as well in the western areas. This parcel here, changing it from R10 to RX, which is residential mixed use. That doesn't mean that the community center is going to change its particular use. It's just changing that use to be more in line within in the community itself. Okay. So I'm going to go through each of these in a more targeted geographic area. The western areas here, we are largely along New Bern, focused primarily on these areas of change. The key sort of differential here is Tarboro. We see this opportunity with St. Augustine's conversation and the plans up here in Oakwood to connectivity, our walking area of the station areas. That really reinforces this as being sort of a really important intersection of the community, and we'll continue to support that idea as the Pool Road and Raleigh Boulevard, this particular area, become a larger opportunity for redevelopments. And then we'll talk about the areas here later part of our conversation. Largely, the western area is really focused on that density of 5 stories up to 7. And there is just that one change to the area, which is that R10 residential mixed use. In the middle stations, we know that there was a lot of community concern about height and densities and that transition from a lower scale to new transit supportive communities. And so we really tested this out. We looked at the parcels, what would be an appropriate transition between those, what's the height changes within that, and then the landscaping requirements, because that segment of the corridor has a landscape feature that a lot of people said that was really important. What we came back with was this idea, as I had said, on the TOD overlay that really looks at it in a 1 or 2 parcel depth along New Bern on the northern edge. And then the southern edge, again, is either 1 parcel or these larger spaces, the shopping center here in the southern edge. 3 to 5 stories for both 3 stories with extra 2-story bonus density on the northern edge of New Bern, with the southern edge at that 5 to 7. Over around Wake Med, because it does have a higher intensity of some of its uses, we are looking at that 7 stories up to 12, and then a lower scale there in the middle. This is the area that probably has the most zoning changes, and it's really changing that base district of R4 to residential mixed use with the green plus. That's that 30-foot setback that has landscape requirements in front of it that continues that community identity of well-landscaped corridor. Lastly, on the eastern side is a variety of changes here because we have these larger parcels and retail spaces. It looks like it's a much larger segment of property, but we're really targeted in the areas of right along the corridor. So that edge is really, in a lot of cases, either 1 or 2 parcels deep, but because they are larger parcels, it seems like it's a larger area. We have this proposed at 7 to 12, 7 stories base with additional 5 stories of bonus in these particular areas. And then lastly, there are no sort of base zoning changes in this area because a lot of it is already mixed use or commercial mixed use, and it supports these ideas. We have a lot of recommendations tonight. I just want to wrap this up in some terms that we can all talk about. One is growing together, making sure that we recognize Raleigh as a growing city and finding ways that we can do this creatively. We want to make sure people are participating in that together and that everybody understands what these changes mean. And 3 is that the qualitative components of this, from open space, community and culture, history, etc., that we are hitting the mark in those terms. And the last piece of this that I just want to hammer home is that this isn't just about issuing a plan and report, sorry, in the way here, but that we're continuing to monitor this. We're putting our thoughts out here. We're all working together to make sure that this is a plan that works for everybody, and that we want to make sure that we're measuring progress as we move forward. So we have some recommendations of how to do this. One are mobility metrics, and so that we are recommending that the city looks at annually reporting on crash trends, issuing preference surveys, ridership trends, making sure that this information is available and present, that it allows us to target and make any augmentation as we move forward. Housing affordability, a lot of questions around, well, is this actually going to work? We have a lot of expertise around this, but we always want to continue to monitor this. And one of the biggest promises we have is making sure we maintain the current number of units of naturally occurring affordable housing within this community, and we want to continue to monitor that as this work moves forward. And then lastly is community development metrics. We want to issue an annual report to monitor the storefront Raleigh activities. That's that storefront that would have resources for community members to access. We want to make sure the community knows what that storefront is doing and who it's helping every year. And establishing a new Bern business improvement district so that there is that support within the business community to implement these ideas. I presented a lot of information tonight. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I'm happy to answer information. I know that you're going to want to review this information. There's going to be an online survey of this information. You're going to have time to review the maps, ask questions, etc. But I want to spend the rest of the evening answering any of these questions, going back to a slide, whatever you may have burning in your mind from all this information we presented tonight. So thank you for your time. Open up and have questions.
Open to ask questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have one question. My name is Tim.
Nice to see you.
My family lives in College Park.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, we all know that College Park was founded in 1910, which makes College Park 111 years old. But if you look at College Park today, the city of Raleigh community development have changed the characteristics of College Park. So College Park no longer looks like a black neighborhood. It looks like 5 Points and Oakland. And one of the questions that I asked you before, are you going to look at the Honda data, which is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act? It tells you the racial makeup of who's living in College Park. College Park is in the middle of Newman Avenue. Half of that middle is a redevelopment area. So I have been curious about what is Larry Jobs' role in this, and I have asked this many times before. The third thing that I'm very concerned about is when you look at Newman Avenue and you're talking about the changes in the zoning, what is the impact on Boyer Street, which Boyer Street, again, becomes a crucial player. There's 3 churches on Boyer Street. They can't survive this. So, I haven't heard you say one thing about the impact on Boyer Street, because you were really looking at changing the zoning. So when you do that, where are all these people gonna park? That is crucial, but on the back street. So I am really concerned because I made a list of recommendations and I haven't heard not damn single one of them. So I would like to have more conversation. I know this is not the place for it, but I would like to have more conversations about my recommendations for the middle of Newman Avenue, which is College Park. What is really going to happen? I thought when Mitch Silver did the zoning, and when he looked at the middle of Newman Avenue and he took it over to Cool Grove, I thought it was racist, downright racist. If you go back there and look at your map, and it shows you those areas, you must understand that's what black people do. So in those areas, you're really looking at taking them out. So you are really using the process of forced out, priced out, and shut out. So where are they going to go? I don't understand affordability because AMI, 80% is affordable. So I don't understand that, and I really don't understand the missing middle, whatever it is. But I have questions, and I feel like you are not answering my questions. And I look back and I read some of your stuff, and I don't even see the resemblance of my questions. So I have plenty of questions, and I have plenty of concerns. Reality is a factor. I live in College Park. There's only 20 homeowners left of the originals. 20. So when you talk about that, you can't tell me that since the characteristics have changed completely, so you're building to the new, not to the old. That's reality. And so I really would appreciate there at least be reality, what it is. Because what you talked about, it's not reality. It's only 20 of homeowners left in College Park now. And then about 20 rental units. So if you're talking about how to make me, don't talk about me, that can only speak for me. Me. How do you take that and make me a part of something when in College Park, Larry Johnson said he did a great job of branding the East College Park and then the West College Park, which is now 90% white. How do you tell me that we are going to be diverse? Please tell me. And I think that part of this should be reality-based because that is the truth. Coming down Swain Street to Tauber Road, that is predominantly white. Then you cross over to Tauber Road that takes you to Raleigh Boulevard. It's not much of us left, which was a black neighborhood. And then when you cross over, that is over in Long Beach. And we all know on one section is housing, but then there's Devereaux Village, there's the Southeast Raleigh Round Table, DHIC board. So all of that will be high density. So I have a hard problem trying to understand and comprehend. And then you also mentioned that you're going down Pool Road and the Prodigy. That's what black folk do. And I would like to say that I'm no expert on CDBG, but I'm no fool on CDBG, and I have 40 years of civil rights experience. Even CDBG states that you can even do demonstration projects where you don't have to move the people out. I haven't seen the city do not one demonstration project. So I am concerned.
Great question. I appreciate that, Lindy. First, for our online listeners, they wanted to have questions. It's a little bit hard for them to hear. So I think the big question is, what about existing residents and affordability? And what, if anything, is this plan recommending to address that? So one of the fundamental themes of this process from the start has been thinking about affordability and making sure that as we're investing in this transit project, we're all paying for it. Anybody who is paying sales taxes in Wake County is paying for it. That residents of all incomes, and particularly existing residents of these longtime black neighborhoods, if they want to stay, have the opportunity to find housing that fits their household income. It's been one of the core goals of this project. And a couple of ways that these recommendations that we went through, and there's a lot to unpack, but just to boil right down to it, a couple of ways the recommendations address that. One would be the creation of a new funding stream that we do not have in the city of Raleigh, called equity funds. And that would contribute as much as several $1 million a year to be devoted to, I think, primarily housing affordability. That would be adding to existing funds that we have to assist residents who have repairs and need some help with a new roof or something else. That's the kind of thing that often drives people to sell and leads to displacement. When you have that big cost, or whether it's an increased property tax bill, to be able to help with those costs. So a new funding stream to help keep existing residents in their homes. The other big part of the answer is that right now, there is zero incentive for anyone who's building a new project, new house, new apartment building. And those are happening all the time, whether we do a plan or not, that happens all the time. Right now, all those new units, unless they happen to be subsidized from a dedicated subsidized source, they're gonna be market rate units. If we don't do anything, that's the only kind of new unit that will be built along New Bern. This contains an incentive where, and Craig talked about the affordability bonus, that for the first time would require for people to unlock the potential of their property, to require that there be affordable units as a part of that. So that would be the second way to make sure that there are houses available, homes available for people of all income levels along the corridor. So it's absolutely something that we want to get right because it's important to the community, telling the history, and we talked about public art and telling the story of the history and the culture. That's important, but it's not sufficient. We have to make sure that people have the ability, and it gets down to cold hard finances and the cost of housing to be able to do that. Something that we want to make sure that we're getting right. We're working on some estimates that look at how much affordable housing is there right now along the corridor. How much, in the absence of doing anything, would there be in, say, 2030 to 2040? And then with these recommendations, how much can we assure is still there in 2040? It's going to be a big thing to get right. There'll be some big asks of city council in terms of some resources and decisions, but it's important. And I'm also happy, I just want to note both Ms. Rainey and anybody else who wants to dive deeper into this, because it's a lot of ground to cover geographically and topically, that I'm happy to meet with y'all individually, with your friends or business owners or neighborhood groups. We've done it with many people in the room, and we'll continue to do it in this last part of the process. So, good question, and I've seen some other hands going up, Mr. Niptu.
Thank you. Mr. Harden, could you speak to the timeline for this project? I see that, City Council could approve it as soon as spring 2022, but in terms of actual, investment, development, build out to completion, while we also try to work with, our neighbors and residents and, business owners who are here right now, and who have long been here, I'm trying to understand, what's the timeline to this thing being done exactly? And then how do we, stay involved along the way?
Yeah, I imagine that's a question some others share. And so I'll give you a couple answers to different aspects of it. So there's the transit itself, and construction will start on that late next year and begin operating in 2024. So that's one big piece of everything that's happening, not just along New Bern, but I want to remind everybody there's two other in-process bus rapid transit corridors. Same kinds of questions, same kind of process we're going through there, south to Garner, west to Cary. So construction next year, completion 2024. Potential zoning changes to incentivize affordability, that could happen, that's a council decision, but that's something that would be put before them next spring. They could act on that in the spring. New investments and new funding sources, again, that's something that we expect to deliver to council as an option in the spring. So as soon as next year, some additional funding sources. And I think that's something that we've heard from the community, that we've communicated to council. They know that with changes, with investments, come responsibilities to make sure that, again, people of all incomes are benefiting, that it's not, and changes are occurring. I think we all know this, BRT or not, planning or not, changes are occurring in these neighborhoods. But to be able to make sure that we're not adding to displacement, that actually we think we have the opportunity to mitigate that displacement through some of these decisions and investments.
But to the larger thing, it's planning and community work never ends. This is a continual conversation. As much as 1910, where we are today, this community has changed during that time. What we need to talk about is sustained conversations and education and community work And so some of the policies we put forward of having things like a storefront for people to come to continue these conversations and be educated and informed of their options, of their rights, of the pieces that they need to be part of it. If you need to write a business plan, if you need to work with a contractor to look at adding a unit to your property or reinvesting in your business, we want to find ways to have that resource within this community so that it's a sustained conversation, not just we do this plan and then let the market figure it out. This requires all of us to continue this even after the life of this plan. This plan is
Has left the meeting.
Okay, so back to affordable housing and timelines as well. I'm hearing affordable housing, are these going to be purchase options or are these going to be rental options? Because someone who has to sell their longtime home because of rising property taxes or a major cost, like a roof, like you mentioned, Mr. Bern, and then is forced into rentals, and we're not talking, I assume we're not talking about a comparable, unit, size-wise, a home has a lot different feel than like a condo or an apartment.
So I want to unpack two things. You said cost of repairing your home,
Sure.
or the rising tax value. The reason we have those two policies in this is to prevent people from being forced, if they don't want to move into something that they may not want, right? Making sure that we have those top of mind and using things like the equity fund to fund those resources so that people can sustain their life how they wish to do that. Two is whether it's rental or owner and affordability side, that is a developer conversation. That is something like we can't specifically say only for sale or only rental. It's probably going to be a mix.
The city doesn't have a motivation or a guide in that. They're just letting it remain up to developers whether people are going to be able to have equity in these affordable homes.
It's going to be an all above strategy. I think we are trying to settle if like it's one thing or the other. We're trying to make sure we look at this in a host of options to make sure this plan considers a continuum of living in a variety of ways. Some people may not want to own a home, or some people may want to own a home, but it's not a single family home. Maybe they want to own a town home, but they can't build that right now. What we're trying to do is it's sort of like you and I talked about, it's that puzzle piece of moving the tiles around to complete the picture. We're trying to make sure we look at this in a holistic manner so it's not a yes or no kind of conversation. It's a suite of options. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
So, again, I know there's a lot of issues around affordability.
Yes.
And the affordable income limit is quite high. So on the questions of the bonus that might be offered to the developer, what will be the cap for defining affordability? And second, what is the long-term affordability limits? So for instance, I think when the city was negotiating with downtown South for some of the units around, Peach Street, there was only like 5 years of affordability. So where did that get you? And to Arcadia's point, you hear the pain when she's speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, plans are beautiful, they present a vision, but I think at this point in history, poor people and people of color no longer trust the vision. Because despite all the promises that we will ensure equity, we will address affordability, when the plan is developed, you see what the end results always turn out to be. And there's a lot of buzzwords when we talk about walkability and mixed-use development and, bicycle pathways and easy access to downtown living and having business loans. Those are buzzwords that attract a certain demographic. because we see it all the time. We have evidence, and we have history that shows us this is exactly, despite the promises that have always been made to communities of color and low-income communities, the end result is that private developers get out in front of us, and there's nothing we can do. And we know that this plan has already hit the private market. So there's efforts already being mapped up to come in and do exactly what we see has happened in other areas throughout the United States.
So absolutely, I think people want to see the details, not just hear the big terms. It matters. That's what in the end determines what actually happens. And so when you hear the word affordability, it gets used differently in different contexts. It means, I guess, it costs less than what the market rent would be, but that still leaves a pretty wide range. Some cities, you see affordable used to describe something that's just less than the median income. Well, median income in this community is pretty high. You have a lot of government, education, tech jobs that have pretty high wages. So to get specific, where that affordability high bonus comes in would be, and you also asked about the length of it, would be only if those units are affordable at 60% or less. So a family making half of the median income would qualify. Or, again, as long as they're under 60. And it would be for 30 years, not 5 years. 30 years, the point at which a building starts to gets a little age, and often you might hear that term, and someone online was asking what does naturally occurring affordable housing mean. There's a lot of it in this part of Raleigh, a lot of it in Raleigh, and that refers to housing that's picked up a little age. It's still in good shape, but because of that age, the rent or the sale price is a little bit less. So 30 years of that, and it probably is going to start to hit that naturally occurring level. The bonus is only part of the answer, though. There absolutely has to be some new city investments, both on a small scale for the repairs and other homeownership costs, but also on the larger scale. And there's hundreds of units in the pipeline on this corridor already, and this process is recommending some funds for some additional beyond that.
But you're
Other
very
questions?
well heard. I want you to know that you're hearing this.
Oh, yeah, the sticking point seems to be money. And there's a simple solution, and that is anything in the corridor. There's a tax assessment to homeowners. It's very minimal, but once you get to the median price of a home, you then assess a millage rate. And then all of that money then goes into affordable housing, helping people stay in their communities, keeping the community intact, so that we don't have, situations in the suburbs, where suburbs name their subdivisions after what they destroyed.
Sure, yeah, that's right. It is a question of money. So one funding source is the $80 million that came from the Affordable Housing Bond that council and the voters approved. That is helping go to acquiring properties and subsidizing affordable units on this and the other corridors. But this process is going to recommend some additional funding sources beyond that. Exactly the mechanics of what that looks like are still being worked out, but it is going to request some additional funding. That concept of the equity fund is going to be a part of the recommendations. So I think there may be a question. We've got some folks online who may have asked a question a few minutes ago. I want to make sure we're giving them the same attention as folks in here. We will get to everybody's questions.
Yeah. I had a question about the Green Plus or frontage, I guess.
Yeah.
And particularly how those properties will transition to the neighborhood behind the corridor.
Yeah, so it's twofold. We're looking at a requirement of a build-to line of 30 feet in the front, and with that requires enhancing that landscape even further. So that's a 30-foot setback of new buildings within that corridor. Then that's really from Raleigh Boulevard to Wake Med. And then that transition to the back is much like they have currently, I apologize, the local term, but it's 50 foot from the property line and then up 3 stories and then a 45-degree angle. Saying that correctly? Okay. So that the building would have to taper itself from a back property line. So it's transitioning in itself and it would provide that building transition.
And one small additional note, just to add to that, if the building is less than 50 feet high, it can be, there still is a required transition, but that can be a little bit less.
Yeah.
But there still is a requirement for some landscaping and some kind of wall or fence between the adjacent property.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have a comment and a couple of questions. So my comment is, first of all, because you're looking at a historically black neighborhood where the lot sizes and the street sizes were much smaller when they were created than they were in the white neighborhood. If we have issues in terms of safety with transportation now, we cannot guarantee when a developer builds, even though we've taken away the parking requirements, that, we can't guarantee that the people who live there aren't going to have a car. We can't guarantee, we can't assume that all those people are going to get on the bus and go where they have to go. What happens is what we're seeing happening today is people, because they're small lots, they can only get one car in the parking space that's allotted to the house. So the other cars are parking on the street. So the streets are not safe. And sometimes you're trying to park on both sides of the street. So then there's really not room for a car to drive down the street. And that's a concern. Regardless of what color the children are, we still got parents with children walking their babies in the streets because in the black neighborhood, we tend to not have sidewalks because it was a black neighborhood. The equity issue for all of this is huge, and it has to be taken into account in every step of everything that we do. Now, the affordability issue, we've been talking to a developer who is already planning to build on the trifecta corner of Pool Road, Woodward Avenue, and Battery Drive, backing up to Bart Street in the curve. It's a horrible place to put no parking, and that's his plan. He's planning to put 40 units on 4 stories on that corner. There's one stoplight for Newbern. There's a stoplight for Pool that never turns red. And the turn into Battery is as soon as you turn into Pool. So it's not safe already. Now, 40 units, he's talking micro units. So these condos, apartments, or whatever you call them, would be between 360 to 400 square feet. And he didn't want to tell us what affordability was. We finally got out of him that affordability would be around $200,000 for each one of these units. And he's only going to provide parking for 40 units. That would come out on Battery Drive. I don't understand yet quite how the front facing to enter on top of Newbern is going to work. But there is no, if that's what's already in the pipeline, and we don't have any of this, but we've got already got the TOD, how does the community deal with the developer when we get to the planning commission? And then I'm well aware now that regardless of what the planning commission says or votes on, the council only approves what they want to approve or disapprove. And so they are well eager to disallow things that the planning commission may be more looking at. And the other issue with all of this that I don't think we've addressed at all is the fact that there are stormwater issues, there are water issues. How much have we looked at when these hardscapes go all around Eastern Avenue, all these creeks and, things that are all scattered through Black Raleigh? Because that's why that land was sold, because white people didn't want to live where the water was going to get on them, come downhill. How is all of that being addressed in your plan?
A lot of time back here. So, thank you very much. Parking minimums, by removing parking minimums doesn't mean that no parking is provided. And I think what you're talking about is my unit is a very acute case. It's the second time I've heard it tonight, so it sounds like it's a community concern. And I think it's a continued conversation on this particular development to make sure it's safe and meets those parking needs, et cetera. It's a little surprising that $200,000 for a micro unit in this area, but I've heard worse, so surprised but not. So I don't know exactly how to address that particular project in this sense, but what I can talk about on parking is things like on-street parking. We can go to a registry program over time with community members. You have to prove you live in these areas, make sure you're mitigating that parking piece. Bigger developments along this area would most likely have their own parking requirements because banks often don't finance big projects without a parking component. And so we've been told over the years we need to find ways to mitigate over parking our communities, and we're trying to balance that with new rapid transit installations, looking at sidewalk improvements that create those safe walking paths in a way that's prioritized and equitable. But I think we need to add a layer of parking as a conversation to this to make sure that we're monitoring and making sure we have a balancing active parking. My experience is that residential parking can sometimes be mostly storage because people may want to use their car on the weekend, but they may, for their day-to-day trips, utilize walking or transit if they have those reliable services in-house. So I don't have an answer right away within that, but I think it's something we're going to take back and come back with an answer. The last piece was on stormwater, and I know New Bern as a VRT program, one of the key components is looking at stormwater management through that process. But the day-to-day monitoring of that, if there are other acute areas, that's something that maybe we just talk with the city and see if we can come back with a broader community answer to that. So thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, Executive Tod. We share a lot of the same concerns that have been raised tonight about displacement. I think the pace of displacement is something that we've talked about a lot in this room already. One thing that I'm not seeing in the plan, well, I'll just say first that we totally support property tax relief. We support, making sure that folks have access to repair and rehab money. I think those things, along with some other recommendations, need to happen sooner rather than later. So I would ask that your team please talk to the council. The budget for next year is being developed right now. So, the forward that this plan gets passed, we'll still need to talk to the city and the different departments about all those different elements. One thing that I'm not seeing in the plan is, with regard to displacement, I think part of the problem is just like land being bought up by developers too fast for us to mitigate the issues. And so I wonder if the city is doing any land banking around transit corridors. And I also wonder if there's been discussion about offering incentives or prioritizing affordable developers, not market rate developers that are offering some small number of units to just affordable developers, like DHAC, like Greystone. There's several developers that just do affordable housing. So the question is, can we incentivize those or help those developers? I think in particular with the developers that use the low-income housing tax credits will be more competitive in transit corridors. So just asking if we can build that into the plan, if that's a discussion that has been had. I think that we also share the concerns around, are the density bonuses actually going to bring us the number of units that we need for the amount of affordability that we need? So just also there.
Yeah, I'd say that. I don't think the density bonuses will do that by themselves. And I will note, Mark, adding more housing just in general helps with that, but that is also not enough. To meet these needs, it takes some subsidies, so we're lucky that we have the resources from the Affordable Housing Bond. In terms of land banking, yes. So as of, for instance, the city recently purchased a pretty good chunk of land right at the Raleigh Boulevard and New Bern intersection, which will go towards affordable housing. And is in the process of, and this is land that the city currently owns downtown. It's currently a parking lot. The plan is for that to be sold specifically for the purposes of affordable housing. That's also along this corridor. Partnering with private developers for subsidized affordable housing projects. So there's one along the corridor just outside the Beltline that's in the works that would provide another couple hundred units. And then on a smaller scale, I think part of the question was for individual properties or houses. Our housing department also looks and is currently proactively looking for smaller scale builders who would create, again, specifically subsidized long-term affordable housing units on individual smaller lots that the city owns along in this corridor and in other parts of Raleigh.
And I do want to point out, one of our recommendations was looking at acquiring the DMV site as an opportunity for land banking. And we see that as a key opportunity for adding strategic density along the corridor without it eating up the existing character of the community.
And also the possibility of partnering with churches or other institutions that have perhaps a lot of land that they don't necessarily need all of, and would like to collaborate on a very public, civically spirited mission of affordable housing. We've had conversations with churches and other institutions, and think that there's a lot of room for that kind of partnership along the corridor, which is a huge, sorry for the cliche, win-win. Or it's good for the future residents of those units, it's good for those institutions who can use some additional resources and don't necessarily need that land. And so I think it's very likely, we don't have a specific one, it's not at the level of we're gonna work with this specific church on the street, but I would be pretty surprised if we are not able to make some of those projects work in the coming years. Yes, sir.
How grateful we are to you for the presentation, for all that you are doing, and the level of presentation and information that you've given to us. On behalf of the business owners on the corridor, I see it coming, not that business owners want to stop this, or stop growth and development, all that, don't want to do that. But I own the funeral home in Newman Avenue, and vision, I've heard that word, I see it coming, that the funeral home is not going to have a place on the corridor. So are there resources, or is there direction, or is there something that business owners can tap into, because we're going to have to move? And I see that and I feel that now. My dream is now going to be displaced. I wanted to be on the Avenue, but because the city owns things around the funeral home, and flippantly said to me, we're not going to sell it to you, we'll rent it to you for $1 a year in perpetuity. But that doesn't help me serve my family. That doesn't help me serve the community. And I'm trying to, I want to get back to the community, but I have to go. So there are agencies or resources that can assist me in helping my dream stay alive.
So I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, Mr. Lyons, a couple of answers to that. One is going to be a little probably general and not really satisfying, but another one I think will be something that we would want to pursue. So one is Resources, yes. I talked about that general concept of an equity fund, money specifically devoted to these needs that we're hearing along the corridor. And probably the one common thread between all of those needs and everything that the equity fund would help us do is minimize displacement to businesses, for residents, to the fabric of the community. And business support is a big part of that. So improvements to facades, visibility, all sorts of potential tools are currently available, but we want to make sure that the connection to the city is there and that the funding is there. So that's kind of the big general answer. And there's a lot of, as you can imagine, fine print and how that works and what kind of funding is there. More specifically, I am familiar with your location. I do think it would be helpful to have a specific conversation and look at what your long-term goals are for that site and see what potentially the options are there. So I'd like to connect with you afterward and talk a little bit more.
I just want to add some color to that. We do identify in our matrix, and I'm sorry if I painted over it a little bit, but the idea of creating a business district, an actual business association, we actually reached out in Atlanta. There's this new Black Main Street that's being created. We talked to the Main Streets program about how do they support, attract, retain Black businesses within that component. And we're going to continue that conversation. I've reached out also to Tulsa, Oklahoma. They recently have gained interest in that. And I think not interest, or gaining traction in that work and reestablishing that. I think the key component to that is just what Jason said, is let's talk about your vision and make sure we reverse engineer into that. And it sounds like there's some disconnect between what we're doing and who you're communicating with. And that seems to be a policy component of better communication, clearer direction, and guidance from the existing businesses of how do you stay, how do you grow, and how do you say to your partners, come back to New Bern, or you as an entrepreneur that's moving to Raleigh, this is where your home should be. And we need your business community to be part of that, and we want to make sure there's that finance component in that district, that you have that resource and a voice within that. Yes, ma'am.
First one is the state. When Nikki Jones was working with the city of Raleigh Community Development, he told me the city can do 30%. So I still would appreciate if you would define what is affordable. 80% of the AMI is affordable, 60% affordable. So, but if you're looking at how many people that is 30 and below, the city sees, according to Nikki Jones, they don't do that. Now, that's what Nikki Jones told me, point blank. He was specific. He didn't mix his words. I said, well, thank you, but I'm still coming back to 30%. My second question, when Mitch Silver was planning director, Mitch Silver talked about on the corridors with the BRT, there will be workforce housing. That's what Mitch said. Now, to my understanding and the way Mitch explained it to me, workforce housing is for teachers, firefighters, police officers. So I said, Mitch, isn't that a violation of the Fair Housing Act that you exclude people with disabilities? And he changed it and said, yeah. But to my understanding, workforce housing will be on the corridors. Workforce housing serves a specific population. So if you're talking about equity, the people that's 30%, 20%, they don't get to live on the corridor. They don't, not if you're bringing in workforce housing, not if you're bringing that in. So again, I need a better understanding, and with the city's terminology, and I have looked up a lot of the city's policies myself, a lot of their housing policies. I'm sort of confused because y'all said one thing, but then there's that workforce housing that's in the policies. So are y'all excluding workforce housing? Because I think it's discriminatory because you leave out the low income population. So help me understand.
So I just, on the workforce housing, we had a meeting on New Bern after our workshops, and you brought that up. You don't see workforce housing in our conversation here.
Okay.
We're really trying to focus in on the actual metrics. We
Okay.
also heard below 30 AMI was a concern, and we're continuing that conversation. But what we're trying to do is find the sweet spot of policy that maximizes those opportunities in the spectrum of types of housing that we can anticipate within this. And I'll let Jason, add to that a little bit more, but I want you to know we heard you on that term workforce, and we do not want to use that in this approach.
Okay, so Jason, if Kim still here, then I would like to recommend that when you look at the housing policies, workforce housing is in the policies. That needs to be taken out. Because if you will follow the policies, and housing comes with policies, so Ken, they need to take workforce housing out of the policies. It needs to be taken completely out. So that they don't get caught up in the plans, and then the next thing you know, they say, oh, we got workforce housing. Mitch put it in there. It was never taken out.
Yeah, I would just say, again, that this process is not thought about workforce housing, that it is envisioning housing that is to be a lot more deeply affordable than that. Housing for people who work minimum wage jobs. There's a lot of minimum wage workers in Raleigh who deserve a chance to live near a place that has really high quality transit and access to opportunity. The deeper the subsidy goes, the tougher it is to finance that. It's not an easy thing to do to get down to 30%, but it is what we've heard. And the recommendations are gonna address that segment of the housing market because it's important, because if they don't have options to live here, then there's very few choices, not just along this corridor, but in a lot of the city of Raleigh. So it's something really important to get right. We have heard that. I don't particularly love the workforce housing term myself. I think there's some issues with it. This process is not. It's thinking about more deep affordability than that.
We have some online questions, and I just want to honor that and make sure that we're addressing that as well.
Can you talk about peer cities that you looked at for this report and then have done other similar projects and how successful those have been?
So I think the interesting thing is that we're all embarking on this together. We're pushing forward in this idea of equity, affordable housing. It's been targeted for a number of years. Places like Seattle, Minneapolis, that are looking at how do we create zoning language that unlocks opportunity for new types of housing within that. I know the city did, during the ETOD process, brought forward this affordable housing component that looks at the sort of sweet spots of maximizing that potential. And I apologize, I don't have the back history on that in particular. But the result is it's mixed depending on where you're at, depending on the local jurisdiction and the policies that were enacted prior to. And so while we can learn sort of best practices, we're trying to really focus on what's going to work for Raleigh in particular through the ecosystems that have been created, and how do we move forward together with the best practices. So I apologize, I don't have an exact answer of the exact peer city, but it's looking at this in a broad variety of housing typologies and approaches that we can curate this, because one of our policies is monitoring and making sure that we report back on this, because the best way for us to make sure we're addressing community need is to make sure we're reporting on how it's happening in a yearly basis and aggregate and providing that broader summary so that we can, if things are not aligned with how we wanted to plan this, and that goes back to the conversation of vision and execution, is sustained reporting back of this is how it's actually working will help us adjust these plans as we move forward.
Yeah, and I'll mention a couple of specific examples of other cities. So there's two big kinds of ways that cities have looked at this. One is the idea of around a transit investment, thinking about how to allow more people to live and work near there, support the transit investment, reduce carbon emissions. So look pretty closely at Arlington, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. There's a number of examples across the country. The other big source is looking at displacement in communities that either whether there's a new project that's being talked about or whether it's the market pressure of people wanting to live in a walkable place and that driving up the property values. So examples of that kind of work has been done. And we've looked at Washington, D.C., potential of a 14th Street Bridge Park, which goes across the Anacostia River. You've got Capitol Hill, basically on one side. You've got the communities on the other side of the Anacostia. A lot of concern, same kinds of concern that are very real, very present here, and some very creative solutions. Also, Atlanta is a really good example in their project called the Beltline, which is a big former rail line converted into a walking and bicycle path. Incredibly popular, and the reason why I say Atlanta is a really interesting example is because I think they regretted, I know they regretted pretty deeply that they did not act a little bit quicker in addressing displacement and affordability. I think they didn't realize how popular that was going to be. And even some of the people who originally envisioned that project had some regrets about the impacts that it's had. And now they're getting in the game later, doing some of the things that we're talking about doing here, making sure that we're land banking, acquiring land, providing subsidies, incentivizing affordability. So we've learned, and I think other communities across the country have learned from Atlanta's example. And I'm not trying to hold them up as an example of terrible thought process, but I think they themselves would say we've learned a lot from that and would do some things differently. We have the benefit now of looking at their example and being able to proactively address some of these issues in the city of Raleigh.
What we are dealing with is at least 80 years of national and state and local policies across the United States that really hyper-focused on certain types of development, a lifestyle, a transportation system that was a singular transportation system. And so we're unpacking a lot of this and trying to push it back together into a more mixed, walkable, connected component. And that takes us a long time to just make sure we're getting it right and we're not leaving people out of it. So it's gonna be a process as we move forward. And I think just the continued monitoring, adjusting, reporting back, community conversations will be important to the success of this corridor.
There's probably more questions in the room, and there's probably some more questions online. Sounds like online, some people have been waiting. So, yeah.
Can you talk more about the logic of the taller heights and the eastern stations?
Yeah, in conversation and looking at across the city too, we're seeing pockets of density happening in these retail redevelopment areas because they're not as stitched together with a tighter knit community. There is that opportunity to provide density in these areas should the market bear it. We know that Raleigh is a growing city, and one of our key principles is targeted density along the corridor so that we're really minimizing the impact of an existing community in that sense. So we are proposing higher densities in those larger retail parcel areas that can take up that additional height in particular. Any other online questions?
I think they've all been answered at one point or another.
Cool.
We'll see.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to go back to what my neighbor brought up with timing, so that both retailers and developers are able to maximize their timing with the BRT coming online so that we don't have situations exactly like she was talking about, because that's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Those 40 apartments and nowhere to park. And it seems like what she brought up was that the city cannot tell people to get rid of their cars. Make it very inconvenient, I hear, but you can't tell people you can't have cars. So what are we gonna do as all of these high-density buildings get built with no parking options for them in our skinny streets?
Well, actually, if I could, so, that's definitely a consideration, and something that, over time, I'm sure there will be demands from neighborhoods to create some parking permit programs, which the city does do, and that's one way to address it. But I would note that there currently are no requirements for parking already in the city of Raleigh downtown, and some very minimal requirements along corridors where there's more walkability. And the vast majority of projects, not only do they build parking, but they build a lot of it. And where we do have minimum requirements, the vast majority of projects, not only do they have to meet that minimum, but they build more parking. So it's still a rare project yet that does minimal parking. Certainly there are some. And it's also true that as transit gets better, and this is the city's biggest investment in transit in its history, then car ownership rates decline. There's a relationship. Now, that's not to say that anybody living along any of these transit corridors is going to forgo their car, but some will. And some will have maybe one less car than they would have otherwise. But absolutely, if situations arise, as they arise, where there starts to be more cars on streets, then the city does have the tools to require a permit program. It's actually, for a city process, a pretty simple one, and we've seen a number of those. So there's means to address that kind of situation.
There's also, we're looking at shared parking opportunities. So there may be projects that, like Jason said, build more parking, and they find out that they don't actually need all of that parking, but being permissive within our codes to say, share that parking or partner on those parking pools, because the reality of these parcels in these communities is that parking is one of the biggest space takers. Streets and parking lots consume a huge amount of our cities because we've decided that that's the technology that is going to be predominant. So we want to minimize those and find ways to be more creative with our parking through permitting, sharing parking, and partnering, rather than just saying every development has to have parking on their site. Maybe it's within walkable distances, or like I said, residential parking may be storage. So finding those pieces, but making it more top of mind in our process seems to be.
It's a safety issue.
Absolutely, I understand.
It's a safety issue. When you have people parking and they're not ready to get rid of their cars, and they are living in the housing that they can afford, which does not provide a parking space for them. They're parking on the street. It is a safety issue.
On-street parking also helps with slowing traffic down as well.
You can still get through.
Yes, no, absolutely, I understand. And I think we're in a really hyper-focused in this particular area. It's
all
making
around
sure.
the BRT, you're talking, especially in the western corridor of the BRT, are dense neighborhoods.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so, in terms of providing the housing and reduced parking around here, have you actually looked into where people are going to work? I mean, I hear an assumption that you won't need as much parking because people will be able to hop on the BRT, which is kind of linear from what I'm looking at, or they can walk to their jobs. Or the other assumption is that they're in jobs that they can work from home, which implies, somewhat of a privilege, but not every job allows you to work from home. So I'm thinking about people who might need affordable housing and where they're actually going to work. A lot of people do not work downtown. They don't work at Wakeman. So how are they going to access employment opportunities that are scattered throughout the city?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And it is true that lots of lower income residents do drive. In fact, for projects that are funded by state subsidies, they're required to build some parking. They cannot have no parking for those, so.
Or you have a family trying to transport your kids. I've seen mothers trying to get with a stroller, it's a struggle, you need to take the kids someplace. You just can't assume that everyone will be able to walk to where they need to be.
Sure, and definitely some people will need to continue to drive, but some people won't. And what the bus rapid transit investment will do is help them better connect to jobs, not just along New Bern, Wakemed, downtown, but to the other bus rapid transit routes that are going into state, out to Cary, south towards Garner. And all those routes also interconnect with a lot of frequent bus routes. So the number of destinations, the number of opportunities, let's say jobs or any other opportunities where someone can get on, say, a 30-minute transit ride is multiplying because of these transit investments. And so they can get around, and many people already don't have a car, and they depend on transit. So
And it takes them an hour to enjoy.
it does, and so this cuts that down. And the other element of parking, and again, a lot of projects continue and will continue to provide parking, but for a transit rider who can't afford a car, they pay in their rent for those parking spaces that they never use. And so not requiring those to be built means that they're not necessarily paying for a parking space that benefits the wealthier person perhaps that has a car and they don't have a car. So
Yeah, I just wanted to not assume that everyone's going to be able to walk, be able to walk to work or have easy access.
Can I chip in on that one? Yeah, I'm John Anagos. I've been planning and development at the city. And I think the concerns that I'm hearing about parking are well founded. I mean, obviously there's already a parking problem in some of the streets around New Bern. But I really want to focus on what Jason just talked about between separating housing from parking or decoupling housing from parking. Because I do really think that offers a major savings on housing costs for people who don't want to have a vehicle. And then in many larger cities, what you see is that the private sector fills that gap, that people build development that is dedicated exclusively to parking. It is very expensive, and that expense is paid by the people who can afford and want to store a car in a high demand area. And so those are the people that pay that cost, not the people who just want to live there and ride the bus. So I think there is the ability to separate those two values and let people choose how they want to allocate their resources. And one of the benefits that we have here in Raleigh is that in areas like the Transit Overlay District and similar urban areas in the city, we have zoning rules that say if you build a parking structure, you have to put retail or other active uses on the ground floor at the base of that building. So it has the spillover benefit of decoupling the cost of housing from the cost of parking and letting people elect if they would like to make that extra expenditure. It also can have the benefit of creating the more active, walkable urban fabric that we're looking for around the transit ridership so that there could be more jobs, so people don't have to travel outside the corridor to go to their job, and more places to shop and have services, again, so they don't have to travel outside the corridor to do those things. So I think there is a way for this to work out over time and to be beneficial for everyone. But you're exactly right. There are difficult things that can happen in the transition. That kind of thing, changing an entire area doesn't happen overnight. And that's what we want to talk about with this process. So I absolutely respect the opinions I'm hearing. We want to hear these things. We want to think about how to manage this during the interim when these things are changing. So thank you for participating.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Clark.
One of the other things that we're talking about uncoupling housing and transportation is the New Bern corridor, especially in the western part of the corridor, is full
small businesses and restaurants that honestly right now are struggling having help, and are paying more. But where are those people going to live? Because they're not going to be able to live in these developments that are being built or that will be built before you get all of these other pieces in place to provide some affordable housing. And so, you know, that's another concern. Yes, those people might have a piece of a car now, but I know for a fact that it throws my budget way out when I have to take my piece of a car that is 15 years old to the shop and spend $700 or $800 to get it fixed. That, you know, those are still concerns that we, as a community of people who are supposed to care about one another, still have to consider in all of this process. I have a 26-year-old who doesn't want a car, but she lives where she can get the bus. The bus, however, and I understand that bus rapid transit will change this in the future when it comes. But I have one child who works at the village district who catches the bus. She has to catch the bus at 6 something in the morning to get to work by 7:30. And there's only one connection. And of course, at 5 o'clock at night, if she gets off, it's dark. She doesn't want to walk the block and a half, and she has to walk in the dark to get home. So I still pick her up. These are the other kinds of pieces that we need to think about. I know that if the developer that is planning the development at the corner has already purchased this land, he already has it in his mind because he's patterning after Pittsburgh, New Jersey, New York to do these micro units. Once that prototype has been established, it's going to pop up all down the corridor. It doesn't matter about the density bonuses and those things. That's what's going to happen because the land has already been bought and most of it's taken, and they're just waiting. That's all. I think we need to have those conversations and they have to be had. They're hard, and it doesn't sound like if you don't here. Let me just put it. If you don't live over here, you don't get it. The developer tells me that he's here most of the day. He's here from 9 to 4 every day. There's no problem at 4:15. I know he doesn't live in the neighborhood where he's making his money. And when I consider $200,000 for 36 units, that's a lot of money. And you're not going to make that if you're doing affordable housing. And I get it. We're a capitalistic society, so we want to make money. When he tells me he used to be able to drive home in 15 minutes, and now it takes him 45 minutes to an hour, he doesn't know anything about the community after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he's not going to have to deal with that later on. So how do we have these conversations? I know the city has conversations with developers. I don't know, they have a special meeting with developers, I don't know if it's once a month or once a quarter, but I know the city does that to tell developers what's coming down the pipe. And that seems like that gives them an advantage and an edge. We only do this with the community when there's a special project to go out. And that's part of what the CACs were doing. We don't have that anymore. So the community engagement piece needs to be at a point where people are going out in the community to ask people questions. There are still people who live in these communities who, you see, don't come to meetings. Maybe they are elderly, they don't drive at night. We need to go talk to those people. We need to do some Saturday knock on doors or drop off if they have postcards stuff on the back of them. You know, we aren't talking to all of the people who have concerns. And we've got to figure out a way to do the community engagement piece because you all are not hearing from everybody. You're hearing from some. Online surveys are fine, but if my father was still alive, he wouldn't do an online survey. He didn't know what to do with the computer anymore. And we still got elders who are concerned about these things. And when I say these things, I am talking about this community, but I'm talking about the at-large Raleigh community. Because I have lived in Oakland and watched it turn white. I grew up off the Ridge Road. I hear these same comments from people all over the city, and it's not just the black community who is saying this. Because I think that's something that needs to go back. I know we have a new community engagement person, and perhaps that might be a conversation that has with her as well. That perhaps when you're having these kinds of conversations, as she begins to build out what she's doing with community engagement, she needs to come to some of this.
Well, I have talked to my twin long-term homeowners about because it's not many of them. So I want to make that clear. I think it's been overlooked, but I want to make that clear. I have talked to my twin homeowners, and they feel like I feel. And I have also talked to my churches, which I'm bringing my churches together so you can do this verification. They are concerned with Borden Street. I have 3 churches, Grace on the side, First Church of God, and Western, and I talk to them all the time. And I'm not poisoning them. But this, in the middle of Liberty Avenue, which Larry Jarvis has control over the redevelopment area, it is going to be a serious impact on Boyer Street. When Mitchell came out to do the presentation, in the middle, you can only go up 3 levels. But they also changed the housing during infield development. And I told Kay Crowder, you have to look at the pitch of the roof. So especially taking that housing up to the 2nd level, the infield development, if I'm not mistaken, Ken, the argument was always centered around the roof pitch, the roof pitch, the roof pitch, and the setback requirements. That's what I hear you saying too. So I told Kay, I said, if you look at the pitch of the roof and the setback requirements, those would be a detriment to East College Park. And I was correct, because all those houses that were built look like they should be sitting somewhere in Five Point or Oakwood. It changed the entire characteristics. So what you're planning on doing in the middle really matches the new design of College Park, both for East College Park and for West College Park. Because when Larry Jarvis did the plan, he labeled the plan East College Park. So a lot of the new people that moved in don't even know it's College Park. And I hate that. I hate that with a passion. But it's reality. So if you go back and look at infield development, it was all boiled down to the pitch of the roof. Now, I spoke about the pitch of the roof and the setback requirements. I said, but still, that would change the entire neighborhood. So it's no longer a black neighborhood.
So, a couple of things. At first, Ms. Rainey, I'd be really glad to meet with you and the churches. I think that helps us. In fact, a lot of the ways we actually make connections is relying on y'all to help us make those connections with your church, with your business group, with your neighborhood friends. So please, let's continue that conversation. And Ms. Cawthon, and by the way, when I stand up here and I have answers, I don't want to sound like I think I have all the answers to your questions. We're definitely taking a lot away from this in terms of listening and thinking. And I will tell you, there will be changes and refinements that occur based on the feedback that we're getting. But I did want to note a couple things. For your daughter's commute, that pain me to hear, because that's a long commute. Raleigh is in a very awkward stage when it comes to our transit service, coming from when we had a pretty low frequency set of transit routes. If you had to make that connection, it takes a while, and it still does. One of the things, we haven't talked about it tonight, the BRT is the big glamorous item, but the more the workhorse, or at least the unglamorous part of what we're doing with our transit service, is improving the frequency of routes all across Raleigh to 15 minutes or less. And if you're relying on transit to get to a job or work, especially if you have to make a connection, that is an absolute godsend, because it makes what is a miserable grind, what it sounds like, into something that you can do and you still have some of your day left. And that's really important. We haven't talked about it a lot. We've already increased the frequency on a number of routes, and over the coming years, with that transit sales tax, there'll be more and more to get that frequent. And that, for people who rely on transit, is going to be really important. The second part about really connecting with the community, we know we don't do that to the extent that we need to, that we want to. We're always looking to improve our methods. One of the recommendations here is to have a physical presence on the corridor where people don't have to go up to City Hall and, go into the building, figure out who the heck to talk to. That's not easy to do. So you've got somebody, we don't know exactly where it'll be, what format. It could be at a community center, it could be its own space on the corridor, but somebody who can answer some questions and be there and hear from you. And one thing I really want to mention is we've got a program, we just started it, it's called Community Ambassadors, and it is people who live, work, have a connection to the community, and helping us, community members themselves, helping us reach out to people. And actually here tonight, we have one of our ambassadors for this project, Ms. Wimberly, who's been fantastic and did an unbelievable amount of that door-to-door work, going to businesses. I don't know how many times she said, Jason, can you print up some more flyers for me? And I couldn't believe it. She just kept going and connecting with so many people, so many more people than we reach at the meetings. And that is what we want to build on, because it is what helps the city hear from people. It's what helps people connect to the city and get their ear. And it's something we're going to continually get better and better at.
I'd like to see your group do something on a monthly basis, not a full report, but maybe an update every month on the city's webpage. I spoke to several people about tonight's meeting, and they said you're wasting your time. I've lived here for over 30 years. I live right across the street. And I'll never forget, we had CAC meetings every month, and there were several people who came from the city about 15 years ago, and they told us that the city of Raleigh wants to grow up, not out. And they don't want to go to the border of Cary or wherever these borders were. But they also said they were going to have some redevelopment, and it was going to have affordable housing, and it was going to be right in this neighborhood. Everybody was excited. The city did follow through. They had redevelopment. If you go 6 blocks down Jones Street, you're going to hit Cook Street. They put about 80 houses in Cook Street. They moved every black family that was on Cook Street out, and those people could not get bank approval to get mortgages to move back in. When they came up Jones Street, they rehabbed all of what we call shotgun houses, the very narrow ones. Everybody from Cook Street to Charborough Road was brand new. And they also cut about 4 houses in, maybe 600 feet from here. And they put the 4 houses parallel to each other going this way instead of this way. So they like made a little loop in there. But all I'm saying is, people came to those meetings for years. And when the houses got built, they told us the houses would be kept at $95,000 each. Well, surprise, surprise. Not a single one of those houses went for $95,000. They all went above. Now, we don't blame the people who bought the houses. They were mostly out-of-towners anyway. They had no clue where they were moving. But you have to understand, there's a huge trust issue about people who don't understand what you're doing. And they think this is some kind of artificial blind. You're talking to us about setbacks and walkways and whatever. We were astounded when they put bike lanes across Borough Road. Those houses, almost everybody in the next 3 blocks back is parking on the street. They're not enough driveway space for the cars. People moving into these houses now have 2 and 3 cars. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of work to be done, and it might be helped if every month there's an update and people will feel that they're included along the way, that we don't come back in a year and the whole world has changed.
No, that's a very fair, it's one that, working with communities across the U.S., communication is key, number one. And it's something that we all have to work on. And while we're looking at this, one of our biggest policies is, our recommendations is that sustained communication. And that's key, the idea of a storefront, so that it's more accessible and comfortable than going down to City Hall and trying to get that information or navigating a city website. This is not an idea that's just new out of the box. Atlanta's been doing this with their design center, and they're trying to put it in communities that can be a community hub. I've seen it in Chicago, where even private sector uses this as an opportunity to connect to community members and help provide things like access to business plan writing, or just a computer to print off a resume to go apply for a job. I think we need more of that communication, because what I hear are the what if monsters tonight, right? And I can't fix that. What we can fix is moving forward together, and I appreciate those communication conversations. So thank you for that.
Any other questions in here or online? Okay, well, thanks for being here this evening. We're gonna be around for another little bit if you have a question and would rather have a one-on-one conversation. We will be back likely in late February for another check-in. And thank you for being here. I do appreciate you showing up. I know sometimes it feels like you wonder, I show up and say this, and does anybody listen? Things do change based on what we hear. We do have an affordable housing bond because people talked about the importance of that. So know that you're heard, know that it's a messy process, and that we want to work with you to make it as good as it can be. So thank you very much.
Good night.
The recording or whatever.
Thanks everybody for coming. I think we
do have it online.
will definitely be posting the presentation in this video. I do apologize. I know it was hard for some people to hear. We did our best, is all I can say. Thanks to the city staff in the chat for answering some of the questions. And again, you can always reach out to the project team. Jason Harden is a great point of contact for that. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Please keep involved for the next couple of months while we go through final drafting and then adoption and review. And that's it. Have a good evening, everybody.